Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
The air in the penthouse was stale, thick with the ghosts of shouted accusations and the cloying scent of expensive perfume that had long since soured. Rocco sat on the edge of a velvet settee, his posture a perfect sculpture of dejection. He wasn't a boy anymore, not really, but in that moment, with the weight of the world crushing his shoulders, he felt like a child, a terrified, small child who had wandered into a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The verdict had been read hours ago, the gavel's crack a sound that still echoed in the hollow of his chest, a final, brutal period at the end of the sentence that was now his life. Prison. Not juvie, as his lawyer had desperately argued, but a real, adult penitentiary. The state had tried him as an adult for his role in the armed robbery that went catastrophically wrong, a decision that felt less like a legal judgment and more like a cosmic punishment for a single, life-altering mistake. Across the room, his mother, Britt Westbourne, stood silhouetted against the panoramic window of his father's, no, of Nicholas Cassadine's, penthouse. She wasn't looking at the glittering, indifferent skyline of Port Charles. Her back was to the city, her gaze fixed on him. It was a raw, unblinking stare, the kind that saw past the young man's tough exterior, past the feigned acceptance, and straight into the raw, trembling core of his fear. Her own face was a mask of controlled anguish, pale and drawn, the usual sharp intelligence in her eyes clouded by a storm of maternal grief and a chilling, resolute purpose. The police officers stationed by the door shifted their weight, their presence a grim reminder that this wasn't a family gathering. It was a prelude to incarceration. They were there to escort Rocco to the state facility once the final goodbyes were said. The silence stretched, taut and painful, a violin string about to snap. Britt took a step forward, her heels making no sound on the plush rug. "Officers," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it had a thin, brittle quality. "Could you give us a moment? Alone. Just my son and me." One of the officers, a man with a kind face that seemed at odds with his uniform, glanced at his partner, then gave a curt nod. "5 minutes, Dr. Westbourne. That's all we can do." "Thank you," Britt whispered. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving mother and son in the oppressive quiet. Rocco finally lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and swimming with unshed tears. "Mom," he choked out, the word a plea, a protest, a surrender. Britt closed the distance between them in 3 swift strides. She didn't pull him into a hug. She didn't smooth his hair or offer empty platitudes. Instead, she knelt before him, her hands gripping his knees, her gaze locking with his, forcing him to focus, to truly see her. "Rocco, listen to me," she began, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "There's no time for softness now. No time for lies. You are about to walk into hell. You think you know what's coming, but you don't. It will be worse, 1,000 times worse, than anything you can imagine." Rocco flinched, a fresh wave of terror washing over him. "Mom, please." "No," she cut him off, her grip tightening. "You need to hear this. You need to be hard. You need to be smart. The boy who got dragged into that stupid robbery with those idiot friends is gone. He died in that courtroom today. The man who survives what comes next, that's who you have to become, starting right now." She took a sharp, shaky breath, her eyes searching his, ensuring he was absorbing every syllable. "I have fought for you, Rocco. I have used every resource, called in every favor, begged and threatened. But the system, it's a machine. It's chewed you up and it's spitting you out. And I can't stop that part. Not anymore." A single tear escaped and traced a path through her meticulously applied makeup. "But I am your mother. And my job, my only job now, is to give you the one thing that might keep you alive in there. A weapon. Not a shiv, not a threat. A truth." Rocco's brow furrowed in confusion, his fear momentarily eclipsed by bewilderment. "A truth? What are you talking about?" Britt's lips trembled. She leaned in so close he could feel her breath on his cheek, so close her words were for him and him alone, a secret meant to be buried in his soul. The 7 words, Rocco, she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of a confession she had held on to for a lifetime. The 7 words I should have told you years ago. The 7 words that change everything. She paused, gathering the last shreds of her formidable will. Your father is not your biological father. The world stopped. For Rocco, the very air in the room solidified. The muted sounds of the city outside vanished. The plush furniture, the expensive art, the concerned faces of the family members who would filter in later, it all dissolved into a meaningless blur. Those 7 words didn't just land, they detonated, a silent, internal explosion that shattered the foundation of his entire identity. Your father is not your biological father. The sentence echoed in the new, hollow void where his sense of self had been. Nicholas Cassadine. The brooding, powerful, often absent figure he had called Dad for as long as he could remember. The man whose name carried weight, whose legacy was a mix of immense privilege and gothic darkness. The man whose disappointment had been a colder prison than any the state could design. He wasn't his? What? The word was a breath, a puff of air forced from paralyzed lungs. He stared at his mother, his mind frantically trying to reprocess his entire life through this new, horrifying lens. The resemblance he'd always been told he had to Nicholas? A lie. The Cassadine temper, the legacy he'd both resented and carried? Not his to bear. The complicated, often painful dynamic with his father, a man who seemed to look at him and see a failure, a stain on the Cassadine name, it suddenly made a terrifying, brutal sense. Had Nicholas always known? Britt's eyes were pools of profound sorrow and fierce love. It's true, Rocco. I'm so sorry. So desperately sorry I didn't tell you before. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting us. Who? Rocco managed to croak, his throat tight and raw. Who is it? Britt shook her head, a fresh wave of tears falling. It doesn't matter right now. Knowing his name won't help you in there. It won't change the past. What matters is this, Nicholas is not your blood. But he raised you. He gave you his name. And that name, that Cassadine name, is a shield. It's a weapon. It's the only currency that matters where you're going. The logic, cold and razor-sharp, began to cut through the initial shock. Britt was a strategist, it was her greatest strength and, at times, her most tragic flaw. She was handing him a new identity, not to comfort him, but to arm him. Listen to me, she pressed, her voice regaining its steel. Inside, reputation is everything. The Cassadines are feared. They are powerful. They have long memories and longer reach. You walk in there as Rocco Cassadine, the son of Nicholas Cassadine and Britt Westbourne. You are not a scared kid. You are a prince of a very dark, very powerful kingdom. You hold your head high. You show no fear. You make it clear that to touch you is to invite a war that no one in that yard wants to start. The Cassadine Empire might be fractured, but its shadow is long, and its enemies have a habit of disappearing. Rocco stared at her, seeing his mother in a completely new light. This wasn't the poised doctor, the society figure. This was a lioness, cornered, using the last weapon in her arsenal to protect her cub. She was giving him a story to inhabit, a armor to wear. But, if he's not my father, why would he? Rocco stammered, the questions tumbling over each other. Because you are my son, Britt said with ferocious intensity. And because, for all his faults, Nicholas has a code. He has claimed you. In his world, that is a bond as strong as blood. He will not disavow you. He cannot. The world believes you are his heir, and that belief is your power. You must wield it. You must become Rocco Cassadine, in every sense of the word. You must be colder, smarter, and more ruthless than you ever thought possible. You must survive. The door handle turned. Their 5 minutes were up. Britt surged to her feet, her moment of raw vulnerability vanishing behind the familiar, impenetrable mask. She cupped his face in her hands, her touch surprisingly gentle. Remember the 7 words, Rocco. Not as a wound, but as a weapon. They are your truth. Now, use them to survive. The officers re-entered. It's time, son. Rocco stood. His legs felt like water, but he locked his knees. The terrified boy was still there, screaming inside, but something else was rising to the surface, a hard, cold shell, forged in the crucible of his mother's shocking confession. He looked at the officers, and his gaze, for the first time that day, was steady. He gave a single, curt nod. As he was led from the penthouse, the ghost of those 7 words traveled with him, a silent mantra. Your father is not your biological father. They were the key to a prison of the mind, even as he was marched toward a prison of stone and steel. The transition from the opulent, air-conditioned silence of the penthouse to the stark, echoing chaos of the state penitentiary was a descent into another world. The processing was a dehumanizing ritual, stripped, searched, photographed, fingerprinted, issued a set of coarse, drab-colored scrubs that felt like sandpaper against his skin. The other new inmates around him wore their fear openly, trembling hands, pale faces, eyes darting wildly. Rocco, however, felt a strange, detached calm. The initial, soul-shattering shock had given way to a numb, hyper-focused state. His mother's words were a circuit board in his mind, and he was wiring his entire being to their cold, hard logic. He was no longer just Rocco, the scared kid who made a terrible mistake. He was Rocco Cassadine. He repeated the name in his head, trying to imbue it with the weight and menace his mother had described. He thought of Nicholas, his father? The man who raised him. He thought of his cold stare, his quiet authority, the way a room stilled when he entered. Rocco straightened his spine, mimicking that posture. He forced his face into a neutral, impassive mask, burying the fear so deep he hoped it would fossilize. His first steps into the general population yard were the true test. The air was thick with tension, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of violence. Dozens of pairs of eyes, hard and assessing, tracked his movement. He felt like a lamb being led into a den of wolves. He could feel their gazes sizing him up, calculating his weakness. A few men lounging on a metal bench stopped their conversation to watch him, their smiles predatory. One of them, a large man with a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck, nudged his friend. Fresh meat, he said, his voice a low rumble. Looks tender. Rocco's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. The old him would have looked away, would have flinched, would have confirmed their assessment. But the new him, the one armed with Britt's 7-word bomb, met the man's gaze. He didn't glare, he didn't challenge. He simply looked, his expression as empty and unreadable as he could make it, a trick he'd learned from watching Nicholas. He held the look for a second too long, just enough to signal that he wasn't prey, then slowly, deliberately, he turned his head away as if the man were of no consequence. It was a tiny act, but in the micro-society of the prison, tiny acts were everything. The man with the spiderweb tattoo frowned, slightly off balance. The expected fear hadn't materialized. He muttered something to his friend, and they went back to their conversation, their interest momentarily diverted. That small victory was a spark in the darkness. It worked. His mother's strategy, as ruthless as it was, had merit. He wasn't safe, not by a long shot, but he had bought himself a reprieve, a few hours, perhaps a day, to learn the rules of this new, brutal game. Days bled into weeks, a monotonous cycle of fear, vigilance, and performative toughness. Rocco kept to himself as much as possible, speaking only when necessary, his answers short and devoid of emotion. He ate his meals alone, his back to a wall, his eyes constantly scanning the room. He learned the hierarchies, identified the powerful, the unstable, the sycophants. He heard whispers of other inmates' crimes, their backgrounds, their vulnerabilities. He offered none of his own. The questions did come, eventually. A wiry, sharp-faced man named Jelks slid onto the bench opposite him in the library. So, kid. Cassadine. That's a fancy name. You one of those Cassadines? From up in Port Charles? Rocco looked up from the book he wasn't reading. He met Jelks's curious gaze. My father is Nicholas Cassadine, he said, his voice flat, leaving no room for further inquiry. He put a subtle emphasis on his, affirming the bond, weaponizing it. Jelks whistled lowly. No kidding? The one with the castle and all the drama? Heard he's a piece of work. Rocco simply stared at him, offering nothing. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. He was using Nicholas's own intimidating tactics, the ones he had once found so chilling. Must be nice, having a daddy with that kind of pull, Jelks prodded, trying to find a crack. Bet he's got lawyers working overtime to get you out. He handles his business, Rocco said, the non-answer a classic Cassadine deflection. I handle mine. He closed his book and stood, ending the conversation. As he walked away, he could feel Jelks's eyes on his back, but it was no longer the gaze of a predator looking at prey. It was the look of a man recalculating, reassessing a potential threat. The Cassadine name was a shield, just as his mother had promised. But a shield can also be a target. The very notoriety that afforded him a measure of protection also drew the attention of those who wanted to test that power, to see if the legend matched the reality. A faction led by a brutal inmate named Granger, a man serving 3 consecutive life sentences with nothing left to lose, saw Rocco not as a person, but as a trophy. Taking down a Cassadine would cement his status, a story to be told for years in the prison's grim folklore. The confrontation was inevitable. It happened in a deserted corridor leading back from the workshop. Granger and 2 of his lackeys cornered Rocco, blocking his path back to his cell block. Well, if it isn't the little prince, Granger sneered, his massive frame filling the narrow space. Heard you're too good to eat with the rest of us peasants. Think your daddy's name makes you special in here? Rocco's blood ran cold, but he kept his face impassive. He said nothing, his body coiled, ready for a fight he knew he would almost certainly lose. Cat got your tongue, rich boy, one of the other men taunted, stepping closer. I'm just trying to get back to my cell, Rocco said, his voice even. See, that's the problem, Granger said, moving into his personal space. You think this is a hotel. You come and go as you please. But this is my world. And in my world, you pay your dues. Or you get reminded of your place. He shoved Rocco hard against the concrete wall. The impact knocked the wind out of him, pain blooming across his shoulders. This was it. The performance was over. Now, only violence remained. But as Granger drew back his fist, Rocco looked him dead in the eye. The fear was still there, a screaming chorus in his mind, but beneath it was the cold, hard bedrock of his mother's truth. He wasn't fighting for the Cassadine honor. He was fighting for his life, using the Cassadine myth as his only tool. You touch me, Rocco said, his voice low and laced with a venom he didn't know he possessed, and my father will bury you. Not with lawyers. He'll find your mother. Your sister. Anyone you ever gave a damn about on the outside. The Cassadines don't forget. And they don't forgive. You're in here for life, Granger. You think that makes you safe? It just makes your family easier targets. He was bluffing. He had no idea if Nicholas would lift a finger, if the man he'd called father would unleash the family's dark resources on his behalf, especially now that he knew the truth Britt had revealed. But he poured every ounce of the Cassadine legacy he had witnessed, the schemes, the vengeance, the cold-blooded ruthlessness, into his words. Granger hesitated, his fist still clenched. The sheer, unadulterated hatred in Rocco's eyes, the specific, personal nature of the threat, gave him pause. Most kids threatened with lawyers or appeals. This kid threatened a blood feud. He threatened his family. For a man like Granger, whose power inside was everything, the outside world was a vulnerability. The legend of the Cassadines was one of absolute, merciless retribution. The moment hung in the balance, a thread of tension that could snap into brutal violence or reluctant retreat. You're bluffing, you little punk, Granger growled, but the certainty was gone from his voice. Try me, Rocco whispered, his gaze never wavering. It was enough. With a final, disgusted curse, Granger lowered his fist. This ain't over, Cassadine. You'll slip up. And I'll be there. He and his cronies slunk away, leaving Rocco leaning against the wall, his body trembling with adrenaline and relief. He had faced the wolf and, through a combination of bluff, borrowed legacy, and sheer, desperate will, he had made it back down. He had survived. In the solitary, soul-crushing silence of his cell that night, the full weight of everything crashed down on him. The confrontation, the constant fear, the brutal reality of his existence. And at the center of it all, the 7 words. Your father is not your biological father. They had been his armor, his sword. They had allowed him to dissociate from the scared boy named Rocco and become the formidable fiction of Rocco Cassadine. But in the quiet dark, the armor felt like a cage. Who was he? Was he the son of a mystery man, a secret his mother had kept locked away? Was he the son of Nicholas Cassadine in spirit, if not in blood? Or was he just a scared kid, acting a part to stay alive? The identity his mother had given him to ensure his survival was also an identity that was tearing him apart. He was living a lie to preserve a life that no longer felt like his own. He thought of his mother's face, ravaged by grief and determination. He understood her now, more than he ever had. Her confession wasn't just a strategic move. It was the ultimate act of a mother's love, a willingness to shatter his world to give him a fighting chance to survive it. She had handed him a loaded gun, knowing it would recoil and wound him, but believing any wound was better than the death he would face without it. He thought of Nicholas. The man who had raised him. The man whose name he was using as a threat, a shield, a weapon. Did Nicholas know the truth? Had he always known? Was his distance, his coldness, not a rejection of Rocco himself, but a constant, living reminder of a secret that stood between them? The questions were a labyrinth with no exit. Weeks turned into months. Rocco became a fixture in the prison landscape. He was left mostly alone, a respect earned not through friendship or overt violence, but through a reputation for being cold, unpredictable, and dangerously connected. He had perfected the art of being Rocco Cassadine. He moved with a quiet authority, his eyes holding a hardness that hadn't been there before. The boy was gone, buried under layers of survivalist instinct and a fractured sense of self. Then, a visit. He was led into the visitation room, the clang of the door echoing behind him. He expected to see his mother, her face a little more lined, her eyes a little more weary. But sitting on the other side of the grimy, plexiglass divider, his posture rigid and out of place in the dismal setting, was Nicholas Cassadine. Rocco's breath hitched. This was the moment of truth. The man whose identity he had been appropriating, whose legacy he had been wielding like a cudgel, was here. Did he know what Britt had done? What she had said? He sat down slowly, picking up the phone receiver. Nicholas did the same on his side. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Nicholas's face was unreadable, but his eyes, those deep, penetrating Cassadine eyes, were taking in every detail of Rocco, the new hardness in his jaw, the guarded stillness in his posture, the faint shadow of a life lived in constant threat. Rocco, Nicholas said finally, his voice, even through the scratchy phone line, was exactly as Rocco remembered, low, cultured, and layered with unspoken thoughts. Father, Rocco replied, the word feeling different on his tongue now. It was a title, a claim, a question. Your mother is unwell, Nicholas said, choosing his words with typical care. The stress. She asked me to come. Rocco simply nodded. He wouldn't give anything away. I've been speaking with your lawyer. The appeals process is slow. But we are pursuing every avenue. Nicholas paused, his gaze intensifying. I've also heard things. From my sources inside. Rocco's heart thudded once, hard. Here it was. They tell me you've carried yourself well, Nicholas continued, a strange, almost approving note in his voice. That you've shown resilience. That you've reminded people of what the Cassadine name means. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. They say you've told people that to cross you is to cross me. That the family would respond. Rocco held his breath. This was the accusation. The unveiling of his bluff. Nicholas's lips tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was grimmer, more profound. Good. The single word hung in the air, simple and devastating. This place, it's a jungle, Nicholas said, his eyes locked on Rocco's. You use every tool you have to survive. You use your name. You use your wit. You use your fear. You use whatever legacy you have. You did what you had to do. I would have expected nothing less from my son. My son. The words landed on Rocco with the force of a physical blow. They were an affirmation, an adoption, more powerful now than any blood tie could ever be. In that moment, it didn't matter what the biological truth was. Nicholas Cassadine was claiming him, not out of obligation, but out of a recognition of the strength it took to survive. He was endorsing the very fiction Britt had created. Tears, the first real tears he had allowed himself since the day he was sentenced, pricked at the corners of Rocco's eyes. He blinked them back furiously, the gesture itself a testament to the hard man he was trying to be. Thank you, Rocco said, his voice thick with emotion. Nicholas gave a single, slow nod. We are Cassadines, Rocco. That is not just a name. It is a burden and a weapon. You are learning to wield it. Remember that. This is not the end of your story. It is a chapter. A dark one. But you will get through it. We will get you through it. The visit ended soon after, with talk of legal strategies and procedural details, but the core of the conversation reverberated in Rocco's soul. He walked back to his cell block, the same grim corridor, the same threatening glances, but something within him had shifted. The identity he had been wearing like an ill-fitting suit now felt tailored. It was still a armor, but it was no longer a cage. It was a part of him, forged in the fire of necessity and now, unexpectedly, blessed by the very man whose name it bore. He lay on his bunk that night, staring at the cracked ceiling. The 7 words were still there. Your father is not your biological father. They were no longer a weapon of shock or a source of existential dread. They were simply a piece of data, a secret from his past. They didn't define him. His actions defined him. His will to survive defined him. The man he was becoming in this hellhole defined him. And the man who had just looked him in the eye and called him son defined him. Britt's confession had been the key. It had unlocked a door to a darker, harder version of himself, a version that could walk through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil. It had been the most shocking, painful gift a mother could ever give. She had broken him to remake him, shattered his world to teach him how to build a fortress from the rubble. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know who his biological father was, or if he ever would. He didn't know if he would win his appeal or spend the best years of his life in this concrete tomb. But he knew one thing with a certainty that settled deep in his bones: he was Rocco Cassadine. And he would survive. Britt Westbourne stood in the dim hallway outside the courtroom, her pulse hammering in her ears as Rocco Falconeri was escorted down the corridor in handcuffs. The sound of the metal clinking with every step felt like shards of ice sinking into her chest. She had faced countless crises in her life, seen tragedy up close far more times than she cared to admit, but nothing compared to this moment, watching a young man she cared about being dragged toward a fate he didn't deserve. Britt, Dante's voice broke through the haze, rough and exhausted. They'll give us time to talk to him before transport. You should come. Britt didn't hesitate. She followed Dante and the officers around the corner until she saw Rocco standing against the wall, shoulders tight, fear flickering behind the mask of forced bravery he wore like armor. When Rocco lifted his eyes and saw her, something in him cracked. You didn't have to come, he said, his voice tight but trying to sound casual. Britt stepped closer, ignoring the officers hovering nearby. Of course I did. You don't go through something like this alone. Rocco tried to smirk. Looks like I'm about to. He glanced pointedly at the cuffs, then at the closed courtroom doors behind them. Britt shook her head, swallowing hard. Rocco, what happened in that alley? It wasn't your fault. Rocco's jaw clenched. The jury sure thought it was. Dante interrupted softly, we're appealing. We're not giving this up. But Rocco didn't look convinced. Dad, appeals take time. Years. I'll be locked up while you figure it out. The words hit Dante like a blow, but he refused to show it, simply placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Britt watched all of it with a mounting sense of helplessness until finally Dante stepped away, giving her a silent signal, talk to him. She approached Rocco more slowly this time, searching his eyes for something she could anchor herself to. Rocco, she said gently, look at me. He reluctantly lifted his gaze. You're not losing your life today. Just time. Time is everything, he whispered. You, of all people, should know that. The truth of that hit her sharply, her diagnosis, her struggles, her stolen future. But she didn't let the pain show. Instead, she took a breath and said, then let me tell you something important before you go. Rocco frowned as she stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. Britt hesitated, because once she said it, once she gave him those 7 unthinkable words, there would be no going back. But he deserved the truth, even if it changed everything. She leaned forward and whispered, someone set you up on purpose. Rocco froze. His breath left him in a sharp exhale. What? She repeated slowly, distinctly, someone. Set. You. Up. On. Purpose. 7 words that shattered the air between them. Rocco stared at her, utterly speechless, the officers glancing over suspiciously as his expression flashed from confusion to disbelief to anger. Britt, he breathed out, what are you talking about? Britt stepped back just enough to keep the officers calm but kept her eyes locked on his. I didn't want to say anything until I knew more. But I've seen the autopsy report from the victim and the timeline the prosecution used. It doesn't add up. The medical details, what they claimed happened, how fast they said death occurred, it contradicts everything I know as a doctor. Dante whipped around. Britt, why didn't you tell me this? She held up her hand. Because I needed to confirm the inconsistencies. And because if I came forward too soon without proof, the DA would bury it, just like they buried everything else that didn't fit their narrative. Rocco shook his head. This can't be real. You think someone framed me? Britt met his gaze with steady certainty. I don't think. I know. The words were heavy, certain. She wasn't guessing, she was sure. Dante rubbed his temples in disbelief. Who? Why? Britt hesitated only a moment. I'm not ready to point fingers yet. But someone manipulated the evidence. And they did it very deliberately. Rocco's breathing quickened. So you're saying I'm going to prison for something someone else did? Britt nodded solemnly. For now. But I promise you, this isn't over. And whoever did this, they're still out there. Rocco felt the walls closing in on him. Why would someone come after me? Britt moved closer, lowering her voice again. Because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And because hurting you hurts Dante. Hurts your family. Someone wanted chaos. Dante stepped forward abruptly. Britt, tell me everything you know. Britt exhaled. Not here. Not in front of the guards. But I'll meet you later. There's something in the victim's toxicology report that wasn't included in the official file. Dante stiffened. You're saying it was altered? Britt's eyes flashed. Heavily.